Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
I was out on the canoe for a few days, so it was easy for me to forget my mask. I apologize. Please feel free to move around if you're out in the yard or inside, and it's easier to see. So this week, I'm going to shift gears a little bit from the Prajnaparamita teachings that we've been focusing on for the past several months, and talk about OBON, which is one of the most important religious festivals of East Asian Buddhism, and is in Japan, well, in parts of Japan, is happening right now. There's an interpretation of the when the Asian countries met or were colonized, European powers came and things changed there. One of the things that happened is the calendar got fractured in a lot of ways. So some places decided to go with the Western calendar, some places maintain lunar calendar. And so, for example, if you spend time in Japan, or if you know Japanese people, and they celebrate New Year on December 31st, January 1st, 2nd, 3rd. So that's the New Year time. So for all of Japan shifted over to a Western calendar for the celebration of the New Year. But if you're if you're more connected to people who are from China or from Singapore, they will continue to celebrate Chinese New Year, which happens according to a lunar calendar. So it shifts around on our sun-based calendar a little bit. So within Japan, different places within the country chose different ways to treat when OBON would be located. So where I spent most of the time when I was living in Japan and my teacher's temple, this is the time of year where OBON happens. It's called Hachigatsu OBON, or August OBON. But the whole other part of Japan does a Shichigatsu OBON, which is the OBON in July. And it just depends on how they decided to work with the calendar. And typically, I would be in Japan right now. Every summer, I go back for OBON to help at my teacher's temple, particularly for the Segaki ceremony that happens this time. We also practice Segaki, but we do that in the fall. That's the feeding the hungry ghosts celebration, festival, ritual, spiritual work, all wrapped up into to one. But this would be the time in Japan when that was happening, or is happening. I feel very sad to not be able to be there. It's been, 20 years going for that. 1 year I missed, but other than that, I haven't. So this actually would be the day where the Segaki ceremony will be happening at, my Dharma brothers now, the abbot of Shurinji. And I think they are performing the rituals, but in some kind of truncated way in terms of the assembly because of COVID-19. But that's not the reason I'm talking about OBON today. The reason I'm talking about OBON today is because one of my colleagues and good friends, Kojima Sensei, who is the abbot of Zen Shuji, which is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Sodo Zen temple in North America, will be holding a special OBON ceremony next week. Because they have people who come from all over Japan that are parishioners at their temple originally, and now a lot of people who aren't from Japan, who are originally from North America, members of their temple, they celebrate both the July and the August OBON, because they want to respond to the spiritual needs of their community, which has embraced both of those, needs to embrace both of those. So they did a number of OBON ceremonies in July, and then in August they have an OBON ceremony called Jizo OBON. And Jizo Bodhisattva is one of the very, popular bodhisattvas within Japanese spiritual tradition. You oftentimes see 6 Jizo statues, Bodhisattva Jizo statues by the road. Very common. This Jizo Bodhisattva watches over travelers and children and spiritual seekers. This is main function. And there's six. I'm going to unfold this a bit today, but there are six realms of incarnation in a Buddhist way of understanding. And so there's one Jizo for each of those six realms. Those are very common. The folklore in Japan is filled with stories about these Jizos and how people relate to them and how they're alive in people's spiritual life. So next week they will have that Jizo Bon ceremony at Zenshuji, and Kojima Sensei had written to me last week and asked me if I would give a talk. And I said, how about this? Well, virtually, of course. I said, how about this? I'll be willing to give the talk, but how about Buddha Ai joins Zenshuji for the Jizo Bon virtually? So next week we will have a projection of this ancient ritual that's happening at Zenshuji in the center of Los Angeles, outside with these six Jizos and the ceremony that happens there, and then I'll give a very short talk. So the details of that will come out in the digest in terms of the timing. It'll be slightly off of our normal time, but not much, and there'll be some ways that you can participate. So I decided today I really wanted to talk about Obon because next week there will be almost no discussion. There will just be the activity of Obon. I'll give a short talk, but it will be the celebration and the ritual work. Obon is based on a sutra. A sutra in Japanese is called the Urabonkyo. And it is a very short sutra which recounts something that happened to one of the Buddha's foremost disciples named Moggallana. And Moggallana is a contemporary of Shariputra, who we've seen show up in many of the Prajnaparamita teachings. And I'll tell the story of Moggallana here, but I want to call people's attention to something as we enter into this a little bit. And it's the importance of encountering the wholeness of the stream of Dharma as it comes to us. And what I mean by that is it's very easy for us to want to pick a certain part of the tradition that is the one that resonates with us and to dismiss the other parts of the tradition. This is very common within Western Buddhism. We have a strong focus on people saying we need to get rid of the cultural baggage of Buddhism and get back to original Buddhism. I want you to taste how much that smacks of colonialism, and I want you to taste how much that smacks of a kind of grasping that at the same time is denying the spiritual lives of people who have cared for this tradition for a very long time. That it's not our job to say, oh, everything resonates with me, I embrace it all, right? I will pretend like these images all work for me or these stories all work for me. Guess what? They don't all work for Japanese people or Chinese people or Southeast Asian people or Indian people either. Right? It's not as if people who are in those cultural realities even know this story. I would say most people don't even know the story of Moggallana in Japan. Maybe they heard their priest talk about the sutra at some point. They just practice Obon. They don't even necessarily know the story. So I'm not saying that we should all pretend like we're completely engrossed in that, but that we should pay attention to these stories and we should find a way to relate with them, which may include, doesn't really work for me. That's fine. But that's very different than telling yourself a story that it's extra and that the essence is really what we're taking care of in largely white North American Buddhism. Okay? And one of the things that's so important to me that we are able to engage in this practice together with Zenshuji, which is the oldest officially established Soto Zen temple in North America, that is a Japanese American temple, which was there for like 50 years before people like Shunryu Suzuki Roshi showed up and started the San Francisco Zen Center. Right? So the counterculture in the 60s and 70s, which is the embraced Buddhism and allowed for the unfolding of the Dharma in some really beautiful ways through those communities, that is not the origin of Buddha Dharma. And much of our thinking is marked by that in a way that keeps us separated from the tradition. And there was a very painful period when I first came back from Japan that was still going on in the late 1990s, where the Western Zen centers were almost completely dismissive of the Japanese American temples in Soto Zen. They're like, they do all this weird ritual stuff. We're not really comfortable with it. And that's all kind of cultural stuff. We're really about the true Dharma, which is Zazen. Right? So I'm not accusing any of you of thinking that way, but I'm saying if you don't recognize that karma in yourself, or you don't recognize that karma in our community, or recognize that karma in the larger Mahasangha of Western Buddhism, sharpen your vision a little bit, hone in on that a little bit and see what's there. It's important for us to engage the tradition in its wholeness. Zen Shuji, almost 100 years ago, was established, right? was close to destroyed during World War II when all of the Japanese community in that area were taken to concentration camps. That's what I call them. And their temples were the figures were stolen from them. They were used as like storage places for the military. It was really awful. And so we need to make sure that we keep that connection close with those roots. Okay, enough preaching. I'll get back to regular preaching. The other reason, not just because it's important for us to be connected with our sisters and brothers in the Dharma in that way, is also because there's so much for us to receive there. The mythology which carries a tradition, and a tradition carries the mythology, is so important to our spiritual practice. I mean mythology here in not a dismissive way at all. I mean exactly the opposite of that. The stories of our tradition are the vessels for something that is very important. And the stories can seem strange to us. It can take time for us to develop a relationship with them. But as we do develop a relationship with the stories, something can happen. Notice here I'm saying develop a relationship with a story. I'm not saying hear the story, believe it as dogma, and then kind of inflict it upon yourselves and others. I'm saying that the story becomes a vehicle for entering into another way of encountering our life. Our life is woven together through story. And so these kinds of stories, they come in to our consciousness and they unfold something. When they're combined with ritual, when they're combined with assembly, they become a really important vehicle for the Dharma. So in this particular story of the Urabonkyo, Moggallana, or I probably will refer to him as Mokuren, that's the Japanese pronunciation of his name, and that's what I'm most used to, so it will come to me easily. Mokuren, like I had said earlier, was one of the foremost disciples of the Buddha Shakyamuni. It's said that he and Shariputra were born at the same time. They were born in kind of like villages next to each other. They both were in important, prominent families. And they were born at the same time, and they grew up together. They knew each other, and they would oftentimes play as children. And at one point in their teen years, they were at a great festival, and they were enjoying themselves. And after several days of enjoying themselves at the festival, they both looked at each other. They were like, what are we doing? This kind of pleasure just seems like it's not really scratching the itch. There's something else. There's something important that we're not tending to. And at that, they both resolved to become renunciates. At that time in India, that was a path that many people were taking. That they were seeing the kind of limitations of the wealth of the society that they lived in, and there was the movement of forest dwellers, people who would leave their all their possessions, their families, their place in society, and they would take up spiritual practice, live in the forest, and receive alms to support themselves. So they gave resolve to do that. They both abandoned their worldly life and set out for spiritual discipline. It said on the day that they made the resolve to become renunciates, was the day that the prince who became the Buddha Shakyamuni was married. So it's kind of interesting part of the mythology. I'm not sure, because it was before his renunciation, right? So these two, Shariputra and Mokuren, both had become renunciates before the Buddha's awakening. And they said to each other, they went their own ways and they studied with different teachers, but they said to each other, if you get something, if you catch on to something, you promise to go get the other one, and bring them into the teaching that you discovered. Well, Shariputra is usually the symbol of almost like the second Buddha. After his ordination, it's said that he gained a great awakening and became an arhat. I think it was like within a week or something like unbelievably short. He got it, right? And Mokuren took a little bit longer, a few more days, something like that. And the Buddha, in some of the stories, it's said that the Buddha appointed them as his number one and his number two within the male side of the renunciate community, that they were in charge of things. There's lots of interesting stories about that. But as we see them show up in the sutras, they kind of stand for something. Shariputra shows up a lot in Mahayana sutras, and he shows up as a representative of the arhats. He shows up as a really important, great, wise disciple of the Buddha who still hasn't quite gotten the bodhisattva path yet. He hasn't quite understood, even though he's this like most supreme practitioner of the Buddha Dharma, there's still something he's not quite getting. And that's where Mahayana Sutras, lots of them, Shariputra shows up for that reason, right? He's known as being foremost in wisdom, and also in some cases foremost in a kind of renunciate discipline. So when I was presenting a story from Vimalakirti Sutra the last week or the past couple of weeks, and Shariputra and the goddess are having this interesting conversation, which we talked about. Shariputra shows up there. Mokuren, on the other hand, doesn't really show up that much. He doesn't become the symbol of much within the advent of the Mahayana, a little bit, but not so much. He's known for being the foremost in spiritual powers. So I want to say a couple things about that. Don't be too dismissive of spiritual powers. In this case, it means things like clairvoyance. It means things like the capacity to see into different worlds, right? The capacity to know the karmic stream of a being. Within the Zen school, these kinds of powers are de-emphasized. Right? But traditionally within Buddhism, they're seen as real. They're things that happen. They are the experience of beings, that a different kind of vision occurs. And I think one of the difficulties that we find in our modern day life, modern Western life, is that we just automatically want to dismiss those things, or we want to see them just as a kind of a metaphor. I want to emphasize that they are real experiences. But we have become such literalists that when we go back and we look at that, we say, well, if I'm going to believe it, I have to believe it in a literal way, which means like a objectively verifiable scientific study could be done to show that Mokuren was able to travel in this realm or that realm or something. But I want to invite you to just kind of take that off a little bit, right? Take off that need for that kind of verification, and don't think of them as just a symbolic. But think of them as the way in which a person may encounter reality, may encounter it in many different ways. Right? Mokuren was known for being able to encounter it in a way that was not so bound by the typical physicality which we are grab onto. They say that his skin was like a bluish tone, right? Which, what's that about? I'm not sure. But the kind of energetic quality of a spiritual being in the South Asian spiritual ecology, blue is very important there. So that's one thing about the Mokuren. Another thing important about Mokuren, or two things about Mokuren. The last thing I want to say that's important about Mokuren before we go to the story is he has very complicated karma with his parents. And there's shows up in the legends in different ways, but one of the places that it shows up is Mokuren, at the end of his life, he's killed. There's a lot of different versions of the story, and scholars look at it in different ways. If he was killed by another religious sect, or he was killed by bandits, there's a lot of different explanations for that. But the central Buddhist explanation for his being killed was it was karmic. It was a karmic coming to fruition for him having murdered his parents in a past life. So there's a story of in one of his past lives, before he was, became the Mokuren that we know, I forget his name in the past life, that he had this very difficult relationship with his parents, and he ended up killing them. You can go read about that if you're interested. But for our purposes, it's just important to know Mokuren in the relationship with his parents is complicated, right? And in a mythological sense, this is one of the ways that could be brought into the story, that it could be talked about, right? Is what happened in the past. There's other versions of the story that talk about the difficult relationship between Mokuren and his mother. That she would prepare these kind of great things, but she will only give them to Mokuren. Right? As a boy, his name is Kolita, but only give them to Kolita, and she wouldn't give them to other children, maybe her other children or other people like Shariputra, who as a boy. Etc. That she was so focused on Mokuren, she only give things to him. And there are other things as well, but we can say Mokuren's karma with his parents is complicated. So at the beginning of this story, and it's very short, the Buddha and his disciples would be in a rains retreat. So at the time of the Buddha Shakyamuni, the tradition was started that during the rain times, all of the Buddha's followers would come together, all the renunciate followers would come together, and they would spend approximately 3 months in retreat. Right? And the rain is very heavy at that time, so it's very difficult to be living in the forest like you would typically as a renunciate. So they would take up shelter together, and everyone would be practicing meditation and hearing teachings from the Buddha. So it's said that during one of these rain retreats, Mokuren attained spiritual powers. Abhijna is the name in Sanskrit. So this was the place where his opening to spiritual powers happened. And the first thing that he does is, in this opening of spiritual powers, he goes to look for his parents. Another signal that his karma there is tight, right? He's very close with them. They've passed away, right? But he's close to them. So he goes to look for them because now he has the power to see where have they gone, what has happened to their karmic stream. And as he's looking for them, first he goes to the heavens and he expects that he will find them there, right? Wouldn't everyone hope to find your parents there? But he doesn't see them. And the sutra doesn't say anything about his father, but he says that he finds his mother, Mogali, in the realm of the hungry ghosts. And many of you will be familiar with the realm of the hungry ghosts. That's a realm that we pay a lot of attention to. It's very close to the human realm. It's a realm that's marked by greed. Whereas the human realm is marked by greed, but our greed and our clinging is very practical. We know how to use it to make our life better. Right? So in some senses we say is a positive side of greed. Human realm is marked by a positive side of greed. Not that all greed is positive, I'm not saying that, but that we know how to better our situation. Right? Let's make it better. Let's make it better. Let's make it better. But in the realm of the hungry ghosts, they're so completely overcome by greed that they can't take any nourishment at all. And those images of the hungry ghosts, which many of you have seen, where their necks are thin, like a needle, the sutras will say, right? And their bellies are swollen. Eyes are wild. And as they go around looking for nourishment, they can't get any at all. Right? Nothing will feed them. And even if they find food and they grab it and they try to eat it, it turns into something else, fire or pus or blood. And they're in this insatiable greed. That's an important image. It's a scary image. If we're going to encounter the depth that teachings can open up for us, particularly mythological teachings can open up for us, we have to be prepared to meet those scary images. Maybe you can feel something about that hungry ghost realm in yourself. Where are the places in which the insatiable appetite of your own grasping just drives you kind of wild, like out of control? But even if you get the thing that you think is the object of your desire and you consume it, or you try to consume it, it doesn't actually go in your belly and feed you. Right? And you've got to look for something else, you've got to look for something else, you've got to look for something else. To point something out here, for Mokoren to see his mother in that realm, he had to be able to see into his own mind very deeply. So this isn't a story just about him finding some external mother in some external realm. It's also a story about Mokuren finding himself inside of himself, about finding his mother in his own deep heart. And so as you can imagine, Mokuren is horrified. And so he prepares a bowl of food and he travels to his mother. Remember, he's gained this ability, these spiritual powers to be able to move in this way. And so he takes this bowl of food and he takes it to his mother and he gives it to her. And the sutra says something very interesting here. It says that she scans it with her left hand, like she's feeling around and realizes that it's food. And then with her right hand, she grabs the food out of the bowl, some food out of the bowl in a fist, and she brings it to her mouth. But before it comes to her mouth, it turns into burning coals. And she can't be nourished. Her karma of greed is too strong. Even her son brings her this offering, and she doesn't know how to accept it. She's incapable of receiving that nourishment. And this is something I love about the next part that I really love about Buddhist stories. Mokuren weeps. I want to remind you, Mokuren is like the number 2 disciple of the Buddha Shakyamuni, was awakened in like 10 days or something after studying with the Buddha. He's an incredible spiritual power, insight, equanimity, clarity, and he weeps. This is not an isolated incident within Buddhist teachings and stories. The weeping of these kind of heroes. And he's weeping in some versions of the story, the one I like, the Buddha hears him weep. And Mokuren says to him, what can I do? What can I do to save my mother? And the Buddha says this line. It's so important. I hope we can hear this line again and again and again as people who are hearing the Buddhist teachings. The Buddha says, you alone do not have enough power. You alone do not have enough power. This is what he says to Mokuren, who is the foremost of spiritual powers, right? He is the one who, if anyone could use their spiritual power to solve this problem, it would be Mokuren. And the Buddha says, you alone do not have enough power. It's the spiritual power of the assembled Sangha which can be effective here. He tells him that the spiritual power of the assembled Sangha. So in this case, Sangha means the people who are trying to live out the teachings of the Buddha. He says, when those beings all come together, something can happen, which can't happen through your power alone. He says, at the end of the rains retreat, make an offering. There's a special kind of offering called a pravarana offering, which happens at the end of the rains retreat, which would be the 15th day of the 7th month, the 7th lunar month. So that was coming up. So the Buddha said, gather people together to make this offerings on that day. And through doing that, the merit which is generated can break the bonds of your mother's karma to be trapped in the realm of the hungry ghost. And so there are offerings prepared. They're prepared in these basins, ulambana basins, which is where the term urabon comes from. The Japanese reading is urabon. It's ulabana in Sanskrit. And they're these vessels for making an offerings. And the Buddha says, fill them with the 5 flavors. Fill them with cloth or robes for the renunciates. Fill them with the 5 kinds of fruit. There's all this list of the things that the Buddha encourages Mokuren to prepare for these offerings. And as those offerings are brought forward, they're to be presented to awakening first. They're presented to the Buddha, in this case, presented to awakening, presented to liberation. And then all of the assembly is to recite incantations in support of the beings in the hungry ghost realm of overcoming their state as hungry ghosts. Right? And after performing those rituals, then the assembled Sangha can receive the offerings and use them for their purposes. They can eat them, they can use the cloth for their robes, etc. So it's said that this happens on the 15th. It's the first OBON, the first time that this ritual is carried out and these offerings are made. And through the power of the assembled Sangha, Mogali, Mokuren's mother, is released. And Mokuren dances with joy. So those of you who are familiar with the OBON tradition in Japan, one of the main things you'll see is the OBON dancing. Bon odori is what it's called in Japanese. And some of you may have joined in that here in Eugene. The Japanese American community has a OBON festival, a bon odori. It's kind of a secular bon odori that happens every year. I've never been to it. I'm usually in Japan when it's happening, or always in Japan when it's happening. And so a lot of people are familiar with that dancing. On different kinds of popular media, you will see that showing up, like Karate Kid and those kinds of things. Those of you who were here for the lectures last year by Duncan Williams about American Sutra, where he talked about the internment of Japanese Americans, and when they were in those camps, that the Obon festival and the dancing of the Obon festival was like, thousands of people there together, and it was this great uplift for them in the difficulty that they were put in the camps. Right? So Mokuren dances with joy. Another thing that we're not so necessarily expecting to see the second in command doing in the Buddha's assembly. Now, this particular sutra became very popular in China, and then by extension Korea and Japan. And the standard type of interpretation of that is it meshed so strongly with a Chinese sense of filial piety, okay, to the honoring of ancestors. It's so important within Chinese life. And that here was an example of a sutra. Some scholars even think the sutras maybe were written in China. But we have some Sanskrit versions too, but that doesn't necessarily settle it from a scholarly perspective. But we can settle it from a spiritual perspective. It's not so hard. Just listen to the story, right? So anyway, the standard interpretation of the story generally emphasizes this kind of filial piety or filial piety, respect for your parents, respect for your ancestors, and repaying the blessings that you've received through them, right? Which is really important here. And it's complicated. I mean, I don't know how many of you have complicated relationships with your parents or not, but I'm guessing it's probably a pretty high number, right? And Mokuren becomes a carrier for that in this story. He becomes a carrier for our own complicated relationships with our parents. What does it mean to care for them? What does it mean to care for them even as they disappear from this world and they appear in other worlds, which we remain connected to, whether we're aware of it or not? The karmic stream that is their life, we are intimately intertwined with, whether they're embodied or not embodied in the world that we're in right now. That's part of what this kind of story is presenting for us. So how do we honor them and recognize also they have their own karma? They are also bound, and their binding is also my binding. Another thing I would point out in the story for you to mull on a little bit is the spiritual power of Mokuren doesn't transform karma. He can't transform the karma with his spiritual power. Something else has to happen. Power won't do it. Something else. Offerings and assembling are central to what it means for that karma to turn. Now we enact this in a ritual way, and in the story, this happens, right? In an actual way, like in a very ritualized way, but in an actual way, the offerings are made forward. The assembly comes together. Well, where is that assembly? The assembly is not simply outside. That assembly of the Sangha is not something which just lives outside of you. It is also the great spiritual liberators that occupy your inner world. And so to bring something together on purpose in the outside world is also to bring something together purposely on the inner world. They're not separate. They're not separate places. So as we think about how spiritual power doesn't transform karma, we can think about, in what way am I trying to transform karma? Difficult karma, particularly karma that runs through my family. How am I trying to muscle it into shape? Right? Now, that can be helpful. Sometimes you need some muscle. Right? And Mokuren is celebrated for having that spiritual muscle. But in this case, and why I think this story is so important, is it provided an opportunity for Mokuren to feel the limitations of that. To feel the limitations of that kind of power, kind of concentration, kind of awareness that opened up these qualities within him. And the Buddha directs him back to generosity. He points him back to assembling. He points him back to community. And so we have this image, which shows up so many times in the sutras, particularly the Mahayana sutras, in different ways, where the awakening of the Buddha is revealed to be not something which is just located in a fixed entity that we call a Buddha, but is like a net that spreads across the worlds. all of these beings who have to come together. They come together for the end of the rains retreat. And when the Buddha explains this, he doesn't just say, oh yeah, all the people who are camped out here. He gives this long list. He says, oh, the Sangha that lives up in the mountains, that is practicing by themselves, up in a cave. And the Sangha that is pretending to be a monk. This is kind of interesting line. There's the Sangha that take on the provisional form of a renunciate for the purposes of teaching people. Right? All of these beings have to come together for this karma to be undone. It's like the net has to be actualized. That all of these different beings in the assembly, in the community of awakening, are all a nexus of that awakening. This is somebody who, when we're stuck in greed, it's hard for us to understand. We want the spiritual power, the spiritual attainment to cling to me. We want it to be my possession. We want it to be my understanding. We want it to be my overcoming. Right? We want it to be my mother's overcoming. But the Buddha says, no. The overcoming is something which is the actualization of this great interpenetration of our living. And we can know that by doing it. And the doing is generosity. The doing is making offerings. The very thing that the hungry ghosts don't know how to do. This story has some parallels with the story that we tell around Segaki, which has to do with Ananda meeting a blazing mouth. And those of you who have worked with that story and that practice, you might find some parallels here and some different things highlighted. Next week, with the Assembly of Zenshuji and Assembly of Buddha Ai, hooked together in a very strange way, which normally I'm not super enthusiastic about, but in this case I am. We will enact this OBON as it has been done, now for thousands of years, and it's a good chance for us to work with our own karma and to work with a karma that runs through our family. And I did hear, I'm pretty sure I heard that the dancing part is canceled this year in Eugene, which I'm a little sad about. But we can all do our own kind of dance, and then we can look forward to the time we can assemble in that way and dance together. Does anyone have any questions? We have just a little time, if that's...